Okay, hi. So, welcome everybody. And for those who are catching up on the replay, my name's Adele. I'm a women's health practitioner supporting all women, but my specialism within this is ADHD and perimenopause. And today we are doing a Q&A on PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is still, believe it or not, really still quite misunderstood. And women quite often get gaslit and dismissed as it being just PMT, but actually PMDD is far more severe than that. The symptoms are debilitating for women, and can significantly disrupt women's quality of life to the point that we can end up with quite severe, severe suicidal ideation, not being able to work, relationships breaking down. And the most common pattern that we see is this begins at ovulation and finishes once we start bleeding, but that can change, which we'll talk a little bit about today. For those of you who've just joined us, just to let you know, this will be publicly made aware, be publicly available, this video. So please only share what you feel comfortable to share. Okay, so first of all, PMDD is really simply a hormone problem. It's so much more about how the brain and the body responds to hormonal shifts and changes. So I'm just going to show you, for those of you who maybe aren't quite so familiar with what is happening during the cycle. So this is what's happening during a cycle. Now, for those of you who've worked with me before, you'll know I don't really like this image, but for the purposes of this, we'll use it. So this is day one of your cycle here. Around day three, estrogen starts to rise, and she continues to rise until there's enough to cause you to ovulate, to produce the egg. And then if you've ovulated, and only if you've ovulated, you produce progesterone. So estrogen, I describe like the party girl of the hormone world because she's going to make you feel confident and sexy and energized and sensitize that dopamine and serotonin when she's behaving herself. But on the flip side, she's also sensitizing something called histamine and glutamate, which can be very dysregulating for the nervous system, which we'll talk more about. And then on the flip side, if estrogen is the party girl, progesterone is like the mama who comes back to the house party and says, calm down, it's time to go to sleep now. So we need to have these hormones in the correct ratios because progesterone is a mood stabilizer and a nervous system support, which is really important for us to consider in this conversation because progesterone and PMDD tend to get a really bad rap. And actually, what I see clinically is something very different, which we will talk about. But when I'm talking about ratios, I'm talking about there being a big gap here. We need to have much more progesterone than we do estrogen in order to be symptom free. Now, this image is very outdated and inaccurate. This is a much more accurate image of what is happening in terms of amounts of hormones being produced across the cycle. And what happens is from about 35 years on, our progesterone production gets less and less. Okay, so the amount of progesterone that's being produced here is less. So we tend to become more estrogen dominant, not because we're producing more estrogen, but because the ratios here are less. And this is where women can start across the board, whether you have PMDD or not, can start to feel a bit more anxious, a bit more irritable, a bit more overwhelmed, sleep not being quite so good. And this it begins in the late 30s and earlier for ADHD women. But I just wanted to start with putting, this is the cycle, this is what we're seeing, and starting to talk a bit more about these ratios. Because as I said, it's not simply a hormone problem. It's how our brain, which is covered in estrogen and progesterone related receptors. So if we just have a look at a woman's brain here, these are all the parts of the brain that are dependent on estrogen and progesterone to be in the correct levels for your unique physiology and the correct ratios in order to be able to function optimally. Now, no, like most things with women's health, we are grossly under-researched. So I'm going to share some of the things that we know, but this is always open to change because the science is evolving all the time. So we've had some questions come in before. If you do have any questions you'd like me to ask, please pop them in the chat whilst we're going through these. But the first question we had was, what are the key root causes for PMDD developing? And the short answer is it's not caused by abnormal hormone levels. It's caused by abnormal sensitivity to hormonal fluctuations. Now, what the research seems to, one of the hypotheses around this is that at a particular time in our cycle, which may have been in that luteal phase where the progesterone was rising and the estrogen was also having a bit of a rise, that there was a trauma in our life. There was something bad that happened. And our brain remembered the terrain and the environment of the hormones at that point, and that is associated with triggering almost a trauma response and a stress response at that point. Also, another theory and hypothesis around this is in relation to something called allopregnanolone. Now, allopregnanolone is a metabolite of progesterone. It's a neurosteroid, and it's something that progesterone breaks down into. And when we have the progesterone breaks it down into something called allopregnanolone, and that allo is what sensitizes the GABA receptors in the brain, which creates this calming effect. Now, for some women, it's thought that trauma damages the receptors, and we have what's called a paradoxical effect to this metabolite. So instead of it being calming and soothing, it actually has a really negative impact on mental health. So this is the neurosteroid sensitivity. Progesterone is converted into allo. Allo then acts on the GABA receptor, which is the calming pathway. However, as I've said, in PMDD, this is this paradoxical. Instead of calming, it can feel considerably agitating, anxiety producing, and have a really negative impact on mood. So that is one of the theories. There's also conversation around serotonin dysregulation. So estrogen really supports serotonin production. And it's thought potentially that a drop in estrogen that comes in that later luteal phase, although we do have a bit of a rise at some point, it's not as high as ovulation, that causes serotonin to dip, and that can affect mood. There was a specific study in 2003 that was done on that I can share if you'd like it. So that's another theory. Another is around stress and HPA axis dysregulation. So HPA axis is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. It's basically your stress response. It's this communication pathway. So how your brain is communicating with your adrenals. And one hypothesis is that chronic stress alters these GABA receptor sensitivity and neurosteroid metabolism. So long-term stress effectively shifts how we metabolize progesterone. So progesterone goes down two pathways. There's a 5A pathway and a 5B pathway. The 5A is the lovely, calming, and allo-producing pathway. Long-term stress can shift that into the B pathway, which focuses on pregnenolone rather than allo. And this can alter how we respond to the progesterone in the body. And there's lots we can do to shift that pathway. And this can be sometimes when there's been women who have been on HRT, doing really well on it, taking progesterone, and then a significant life stressor happens, and suddenly they have quite a significantly challenging response to the progesterone. So it's not that you become progesterone intolerant, it's that the terrain has changed in the body, how it's processing, how it's responding, how the receptors work. So this is really important. So these are all some of the theories as to what causes PMDD. And for me, there's this massive link with stress and trauma. But there are also lots of things that make it worse in the body. So one being this progesterone to estrogen ratio. Progesterone gets blamed a lot for PMDD because the basic thinking is, oh, well, I feel awful in that phase, and that's where progesterone's high. But what's happening when we take that basic understanding is that we're assuming you've ovulated, and we don't know that unless you're testing every day with something like Mirror. And it's assuming that you're producing really good levels of progesterone to keep the estrogen in check. So whilst I can see why people can say, oh, it's the progesterone because that's where I'm producing progesterone and that's the problem, but actually that's not what I see clinically. What I see time and again clinically is there's insufficient progesterone to estrogen. And when we get that right, we can see significant improvements. And this builds on the work of Dr. Katerina Dalton, who in the 50s and 60s was using very high dosing body identical progesterone, not synthetic progestins, body identical progesterone to treat PMT and what was PMDD, even though it hadn't been officially recognised then. And Carol Peterson has continued this work in her legacy. So we've got that estrogen to progesterone ratio. We want to look at blood sugar regulation, histamine, and gut health, because this is inflammation, and inflammation plays a big role. So when we're dealing with a classic PMDD, once we get these estrogen to progesterone ratios right, we make sure that lifestyle is processing, is working on those pathways to support going down that 5A pathway. We're looking at blood sugar, we're looking at histamine, we're looking at gut health. Everything starts to calm down. And these are the factors that affect it as well. So that's where we see a notable difference. So hopefully that's explaining that this isn't just about a hormone imbalance. It's nervous system, it's brain sensitivity, it's lifestyle, it's inflammation that can all show up and have an impact. So hopefully that answers that question. The second question, can PMDD show up on and off, not every cycle? And the short answer is yes. And this can feel really confusing because, as you can see, there are lots of factors that affect the severity of PMDD. And you might have ovulated beautifully one month and produced a lot of progesterone, or the next month you might not have ovulated, or you might not have produced the amount of progesterone, or you could have had a significant period of stress where you will automatically become more progesterone deficient. More likely you will have more blood sugar dysregulation, your sleep won't be optimal, there'll be more inflammation. So that blood sugar stability, stress levels, your sleep quality, inflammation and histamine load, life events. So we're so beautifully complex as women. So much of the mainstream medical and lifestyle advice does not take into account our hormonal fluctuations, and they're huge. And it's not because the hormones are the problem, it's because our lifestyle and landscape and the terrain of the body has shifted and changes. Okay, so even though we might be ovulating consistently, our capacity to tolerate the luteal phase changes isn't consistent, because it's so, how many women, quite often in January you have an horrible period because most people's circadian rhythm, diet, lifestyle completely changes in January, and the menstrual cycle shows that. In December we change it for Christmas, and then in January the period speaks to that. Okay, so there's significant cycle variability, and this is really quite well documented in some of the PMDD literature. But so yes, you can have PMDD and it doesn't need to be the same every single month. So the next question, can your symptoms occur outside of the 2 weeks pre-period? So technically, the DSM-5 is the criteria by which PMDD has to be diagnosed. Okay, so symptoms, which are largely linked to mental health, but can include physical as well, are absent in the follicular phase, so those first 2 weeks, and they peak in the luteal phase, so those last 2 weeks before your bleed. So that is technically how the diagnosis would occur. Okay, so classic PMDD is ovulation up until your period. But that's not real life. It's a lot messier, especially if you're in perimenopause, especially if you have ADHD in the mix. ADHD women are 10 times more likely to have PMDD. And this is really sad to me because I often see women in clinic who have felt their PMT is severe, but they've just been gaslit and told, no, it's just PMT. And we start thinking then, is something wrong with us? We're not coping like other women. And actually, it's more likely to be PMDD, which is severe. So if symptoms occur, you might have an ovulation dip, there might be histamine spikes, there might be blood sugar crashes, there might be some kind of reactivity to the progesterone and metabolites, or it might be something entirely different. If it's happening across the cycle, it might be something called premenstrual exacerbation. And this is where underlying issues that are already there are exacerbated across the cycle in relation to hormones. So you really want to unpick this and see, okay, what is it that we're dealing with here? So yes, classically symptoms are throughout the cycle. If it's happening throughout the luteal phase and not the follicular, if it's across the cycle, I'm thinking this isn't just PMDD. That would be my opinion. Every practitioner that you're going to speak to would probably, is going to have their own view. But usually for me, if this is happening across the cycle, there's something else going on. But it doesn't mean that it can't be PMDD, especially, like I say, in perimenopause, when women can often feel like they're wading through treacle for most of their cycle. So the next question, what are the key survival tools during an episode? And this for me is really personal, because everybody's life is very different. If you have children to look after, it is very difficult to really prioritize your own needs, particularly if they have complex needs. If you have a work to do, you have a job to do, you have to show up. It is very difficult because ideally we would all be laying on a beach in Bali, being fed beautiful green juices and protein and sitting in the sunshine relaxing. That's really what we want to do when there's a PMDD flare, is that we drop all responsibilities and make our life easier. But no one's living like that. So what we have to do is go, okay, this is happening. One, how do I significantly reduce what is demanded or required of me during that time? That might look like, if you're someone who cooks in your house, that might be right. During those 2 weeks, we're getting the pre-prepared gusto boxes, or anything that starts to feel like I can lift the pressure and the load. Okay. So start looking at what your expectations are, your responsibilities. It might be, right, my children are not having play dates in that time. I am not committing to social events. If I have to go to work, I'm going to make sure I'm taking a lunch break and getting outside in nature. I'm going to make sure that after work, I have nothing to do. It's complete downtime. So it's really looking at where your symptoms flare and using menstrual cycle awareness to say, right, how do that time in my diary, how does that have to look different to the rest of the time? What can you catch up on? If you make everything as simplified and pull back as easy as possible in those phases, then how can you pick that up in other phases? Okay, so it might be, I don't want to see anyone with PMDD going to a HIIT class or going to smash it at the gym, because the capacity isn't there in the body and you're just going to create more inflammation with recovery. So it's really pulling back. But what might feel nice is some somatic movement, walking in nature, doing some yoga, and you save the hard hitting stuff for the other times of your week. So really managing your diary around your unique ebb and flow. In the moments while it's happening, I'd suggest really reducing stimulation. And this, quite honestly, go in a room, dark blind, dark eye mask on, even if it's in the middle of the day, no sound, no noise, completely calm down the nervous system. Just sit, and even if you do that for 20 minutes or for an hour, I call this a dark ritual. You just sit and just sit in the still, sit in the silence. If you're somebody whose brain's very active, take a pen and paper, and even if you can't see, just any word that comes up, even if you're thinking about the chicken, get a chicken out the freezer, put it in your notes. If you're thinking about what you've got to do later, you've got to pick the children up, put it in your notes. Download, clear the brain, clear the brain. It's a bit like an emotional vomiting, but you're just calming everything down. But getting that still, reducing stimulation. Blood sugar stabilization, proteins and natural salts are really important here. So having those adrenal cocktails, your water, some natural salts, not table salt, some vitamin C to support those adrenals. Nervous system downregulation. Checking in what phase is what phase of nervous system regulation am I in? Am I in fight? Am I in flight? Am I in fawn? Am I in freeze? Notice where you are. And if you're in, for example, freeze, okay, what does my body need right now? Okay, it needs to move, but I can't actually move. But can I move my hands with my breath? So noticing what your body needs. It's not just a case of, oh, I'm dysregulated, I need to sit in a corner and quiet my mind. That could be an ADHD nightmare. But actually, it's about, my body is in this state. What does my body need to move through it? Maybe it's breathing in for 4 and out for 6, so extending that exhale. Maybe it's getting outside and putting your feet or your whole body just on the ground. We keep it simple but effective. Just noticing, if you're on the sofa and you think, I can't move, noticing that the sofa's holding you, you're being supported. Gently and slowly orient around the room. Gently move your eyes. When your eyes move slowly, the nervous system receives, oh, I'm safe. So you start to look at things that you like or are just neutral to you. So moving around. So orienting, grounding, centering. Maybe stand up and just wobble a bit from left to right to help come back into center. These all help to downregulate the nervous system and are not consuming. And as I said, really removing pressure. This is not time to push through. it will backfire on you. Um, Also, some supplements that you can have in place are magnesium glycinate, really calming, really supportive for GABA. Theanine, again, really good at balancing GABA and that glutamate, which I said estrogen sensitizes glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter that is very excitatory. It also stimulates histamine, which we'll talk about. So it helps, L-theanine helps to balance that out. If you know histamine is an issue for you, and histamine doesn't always look like hives and hay fever, although they're markers. If you've got gut issues, if you find yourself having heart palpitations, if you're feeling anxious and don't understand why, if your sleep is disrupted, these can be markers of histamine. So for some women, antihistamines can be really supportive in that phase if histamine is driving it. If you're somebody who wants to look at medical intervention, then SSRIs can be used in short-term luteal use, but obviously you'd need to work with a prescriber around that. When we're looking at longer-term stabilization, I want to make sure your gut is in optimal health, your blood sugar is regulated, your nervous system is supported, and you're getting trauma support, as well as looking at whether progesterone is appropriate to be dosed for you with a prescriber. These are things I want to look at. And when I'm talking about gut, this might be a big issue in terms of driving inflammation, but quite often addressing things like gut, histamine, liver processing, because the way the liver processes estrogens can have an impact on your mood as well. They take capacity. And I cannot take a woman on a journey, and you should not, in my opinion, be taken through an intense protocol of gut healing and histamine when you haven't got the capacity. Okay, if you are feeling completely overwhelmed with life, you're not sleeping, your mood is dysregulated, the last thing you need is someone saying to you, right, now you're going to go on an elimination diet. You're not going to have X, Y, and Z for the next 6 weeks. You're going to need to take supplements at this time. I am sure you'd be a very resilient woman who would dig deep and go, right, I'm going to do it. But it would add to the burden. It would add to the stress. So for me, it's really important we stabilize you first. We stabilize the progesterone, we stabilize the nervous system, we stabilize the blood sugar. And then once capacity increases, we start to look at some of these more intense areas. But that stabilization is really important. Then what is the link between histamine and PMDD? So this is such a misunderstood and under talked about piece. Basically, as estrogen rises in that beginning part of the cycle, it also increases histamine. And then the more histamine there is, the more it stimulates estrogen release. So you get caught in this vicious cycle of estrogen and histamine feeding each other. Okay. So you can imagine this is building up on the way to ovulation when estrogen peaks and histamine peaks. Now, progesterone acts similarly to an antihistamine. It's much more likely to stabilize the mast cells that produce the histamine. So insufficient progesterone, histamine is rising because of the estrogen rising, and there isn't the progesterone to help regulate that, women can find themselves in a really histamine intolerant state. And ADHD women are much more likely to have this. And the problem here is that histamine has a negative impact on mood for many women. Now, it acts like a neurotransmitter and again is excitatory and stimulating, which sounds really good fun, but it's really not. So, I mean, there was a study done in 2007 that showed that as estrogen increased, histamine it also increased and reduced something called DAO activity. Now, DAO is an enzyme in the gut that breaks down histamine. So if we reduce its activity, you're going to have even more histamine. This is really important for PMDD. So what I would say is I see histamine being an issue for some women with PMDD and not with others. Some women do trial an antihistamine to see if it helps improve things. And there are studies that are going on to look at whether histamine can be used for things like anxiety. But like with everything, it depends on what is driving it for you. Just because, you know, someone's talking about PMDD online, talking about histamine, doesn't mean that's what's driving it for you. And it takes time to layer these things back and say, let's look at this, let's look at this, which is a frustratingly long journey sometimes. But in this context, it's really important that histamine can drive anxiety, insomnia, rage. histamine, like highly flares, skin flares, headaches. So there's definitely something that really needs to be explored. So our next question is PMDD a progesterone intolerance? No, is the answer to that. So lots of women think they're in progesterone intolerance. And for me, I am yet to find someone where that is the truth. Because what it is a reflection of the fact that we have a system that does not understand progesterone or women's bodies. And what an example here is there's messaging at the moment that ADHD women are progesterone intolerant, which is utter nonsense. It's ridiculous. One influencer said it, and now it's become truth. And it's not true. I have a large community of ADHD women, and many are not reacting to progesterone. In fact, they fly on high progesterone. The problem is the dose, usually, it's a low dose of progesterone. So when we're looking at PMDD, is it progesterone intolerance? No, it's not. But as we've spoken about, it can often be a response to the progesterone metabolites, especially allopregnanolone, which acts unpredictably on these GABA receptors. So it's not that the progesterone is bad, it's how your brain might be responding to it at that time. Okay. And again, what we tend to see is if women want to use progesterone, that we need to go into what I call the dosing dance of getting the right dose, the right type, the right timing. And that takes time because we're going in and we're meeting edges. Okay. And next question. Why does PMDD get worse in perimenopause? It's such a great question because it does. And women who've never had it suddenly get it. Okay. So, firstly, perimenopause is a time of life where inflammation is really high. Hormones obviously become very erratic. So, I see a lot of hormone data. And usually from 35 up until even late 40s, estrogen's fine. Estrogen isn't declining for most women then, but progesterone is. But we start then putting more estrogen in women's bodies when they don't need it. And the progesterone is never able to get on top. So we then go into a phase after the progesterone's dropped and the estrogen's been okay. Estrogen then starts wildly fluctuating. One day it can be up here, and the next day it can literally be on the floor. We see this happening. You will produce the highest levels of estrogen you've ever produced in your life in perimenopause. If you have a liver that isn't optimally processing those, that's going to cause a big problem on your mood. So this wild, erratic patterning that is very common in this season. Of course, we're more likely to have a mood response to that because these hormones are the most powerful biochemicals in your body. And so the swings, the nervous system disruption, because your endocrine system and your nervous system are inextricably linked. They are communicating with each other all the time. So we're looking at lower progesterone in relation to estrogen. We become much more blood sugar on the instability there. We see more of that. We see more inflammation generally. We see the gut microbiome changing. Women suddenly start getting bloated, and that's because the gut microbiome is changing. And of course, because we're more estrogen dominant, we become more histamine. So yes, absolutely, it can get worse in perimenopause. Then we have, can ADHD make PMDD worse? Yes, like I've said, 10 times more likely to have both because there's this link with estrogen and the neurotransmitters and progesterone and neurotransmitters. This can have a significant impact on executive function in that luteal phase. And emotional regulation becomes a lot harder. So yes, those two come together. Does one or the other make the other one worse? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, but absolutely, yes, they present together and they affect each other. And what I find is when we can get on top of the PMDD, the ADHD becomes a lot more manageable in that time. And then finally, can PMDD be healed? And this is where I'd get really honest. It would be irresponsible of me to say, yes, we can heal this. But absolutely, I see time and again, you can reduce the severity and reclaim your life when we can get to the root cause of what is happening and causing it. And there's the capacity to make the changes. And that is hard because it's really easy to be good with our lifestyles when we feel good, when we feel great. right? But when we don't, it's really hard to go, I need to wake up in the morning, not look at my phone. I need to get an adrenal cocktail. I need to get sunlight in my eyes before 8:30. I need to have at least 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes to an hour of waking up. I want to get some breath work in. And then I've got to do my day and my children. And then I need to think about lunch. It's not realistic when you're on your knees. So it takes a lot of time for some women. For some other women with PMDD, they start taking a good dose of progesterone and the world's a wonderful place again. There's just no magic formula with any of these things. But for me, it's regulation, stabilization, not thinking there's a quick fix to this. HRT definitely is not a quick fix. It can be for some women, but for many, it's not. It takes time. Um, and there may always be this vulnerability to going into that if life, you could get on top of this, you're like, right, I know the tools in my toolbox that work for the reasons I feel this way, but life might life you, life will life you, and that all kind of goes again. But the difference is and that PMDD could be a vulnerability that flares up for you. But if you've got that toolbox to come back to, it's like, actually, I've let my blood sugar go, my circadian rhythm is out, histamine is flaring up. What can I do about this? Is a really empowering approach. And that's really important to me, that women are the captain of their ship around their bodies and not just feeling powerless and victim to this cycle that we go, oh gosh, it's day 12. I know I'm about to like fall into the jaws of hell again. Actually, how do we make a more proactive approach? So we're coming to the end of the Q&A. I'm just going to check the chat. Okay, I'm on HRT. I'm really struggling with huge sensitivity to hormone changes. I take Mazat, I can't pronounce that word, so I'm ever so sorry, which really stabilizes my hormones. I can't manage without it, but it gives unwanted side effects. Is this similar to using antidepressants in the luteal phase for PMDD? Um, no doctors seem to understand what is going on in my brain. Do you know what? I really feel you on that, because this is the problem. How many women feel completely unseen, invisible, misunderstood? And the reason you feel like that is because they don't. That's the truth. And I think the best we can work with when we're looking for a practitioner is someone who's going to get curious with us, who's open to new information, who's maybe willing to go on off license. Okay. So, what you're describing isn't unusual in women who are very sensitive to hormone shifts and changes, especially on HRT. This is why I'm not a fan of mainstream models of HRT, because they're just like, hey, question, here's the progesterone, off you go. And it's really like, how do you know what's doing what? How's it working? I'm not saying that's what you're on, but it's one of the reasons I don't like that. So it just means that your brain, it doesn't mean that the hormones are wrong or your body doesn't like them. It just means it's reacting strongly to the shift. So is your medication doing something similar to the luteal phase SSRIs that I spoke about? Yes, but in a different mechanism. Because it works, or the medication you're taking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that medication is that it works on serotonin and noradrenaline. It also has an effect on histamine receptors as well. So it's calming. So it can be sort of a bit of a buffering against hormonal shifts. Whereas SSRIs increase serotonin availability. So they also, for PMDD, can indirectly affect that GABA receptor with their allo. So yes, the overlap is that they are increasing your brain tolerance to the hormonal shift, but it's not fixing and it's not balancing anything directly, which may or may not matter to you. But they are stabilizing the response, which would be along the lines of what the SSRIs would be, but they're just different processes in the body. Is there a possible link with thyroid issues and PMDD? Yeah, that's a great question. So I wouldn't say there's anything that thyroid causes PMDD. But yes, absolutely, it's linked. The hormones operate in a system, and if one goes down, they're all affected. And thyroid is really a hormone that often gets missed when we're looking at mood, cognitive function, because thyroid levels directly impact dopamine. They low thyroid can make you feel really quite depressed and low. So low thyroid is really like slowing everything down. Thyroid is high, it's very anxiety, very high stimulation. And those things could be misdiagnosed as a mental health condition across the board, not just PMDD. And it's one that's quite simple to check. I mean, most doctors don't do a full panel thyroid test. They just test TSH, T3, and T4, which don't give a full picture. A full panel is really what we need if you think thyroid is involved. But things that affect thyroid are gut inflammation, adrenal function. So if the adrenals are stressed, and low progesterone. So you can see that with the things that we've spoken about today, if there's a thyroid issue, it's really not going to be helping PMDD and could be part of the experience. And this is so often what we're doing with hormones is going through this peeling back the onions, because it's not what these hormone issues don't exist in a vacuum. It's not, oh, that's a thing and we'll just sort that out. Oh, we just need to chuck a bit of progesterone at it and it'll be fine. It's not. We need to keep going through these different layers, and we might have resolved something and then it comes back again a few months down the line in a different way. So it really is working with the system and taking an evidence-based approach. So I don't have any more questions to be asked. I will be posting this in the school community. You're very welcome to ask me anything over there. I really hope that was useful. And if there's nothing else coming through, I would just ask that your takeaway from today is not PMDD is not your body failing you, which is what it can really feel like. To me, it's much more about a system that is almost saying, I can't cope with this level of change and shift that's happening right now. And what we want to do is increase your capacity to move through that season safely. So I hope that helps. Thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to connecting with you more in the school community.